in terms of like various specific philosophies at work, I mean, I think that in the world of film theory, you see a lot of work being done to put philosophy in dialogue with cinema, and I think that it works quite well that way. I think in terms of this kind of contemporary Italian cinema, rather than seeing directors depart from a really specific philosopher or philosophical point of view, you see them instead putting this sort of ethical engagement at work. And then I think our work as academics is often that of putting that in dialogue with wider discussions of philosophy and ethics. But would you mind saying more about the anti-speciesist philosophers?
Well, the anti-speciesists, they're all moral philosophers, so I'd consider ethics as being a sub-discipline of philosophy. And there's people like Peter Singer, who's a utilitarian. He's a famous guy at Princeton now. He used to be in Australia. They'll often, like analytic philosophers, think of thought experiments and say, you know, well, is species really relevant? Suppose there were extraterrestrials, I'll call them Martians, that had the same mental lives, I'll call it broadly, as we do, had similar emotions and thoughts and desires and so forth. Wouldn't we be unjustified in treating them any differently than we treat each other? And hence, it's supposed to evoke the intuition that we wouldn't, and hence it suggests that species isn't relevant in itself in the way. Then they also compare it to people thought at one time that differences in gender or differences in race were morally relevant, but we've come to think otherwise, and why should we think that species is any more relevant in itself than those other distinctions? So they argue like that and try to, by examples and analogies and whatnot, convince you that species is not morally relevant in itself, and so we ought to consider other species on a par with how we consider humans. And then they'll compare, say, of course there are different levels of mental life in humans, but maybe there are I don't know, animals, goats or pigs or whatever, that have a comparable mental life to severely retarded children, but we shouldn't eat them or raise them for food or use them in experiments. So how could we justifiably do something similar with respect to animals? So I'm giving you a sketch of the kinds of arguments they give.
And I think I've come across Peter Singer's name in one of the readings that I've done. Haraway, I find so interesting because she is a biologist herself, and doesn't certainly try to collapse all characteristics to say there's nothing distinguishable between them. Actually, Roberto Marchesini also is into cognitive animal science. I mean, that's his area of study. And I think their point is often simply that we can't find very many meaningful distinctions that would apply to all humans, as you're sort of saying, that would definitively always separate them from animals. And so it's sort of advocating that degree of caution in erecting those boundaries, even though Haraway is happy to recognize some of the things that make dogs different and from humans and wonderful companion animals for them, and then sort of recognizes this sort of play between companion species. She also says it's not always an easy cohabitation. So she talks a lot about how it's something that has to be constantly renegotiated. But so it doesn't quite arrive at anti-speciesism, but I think it's something very close.
Yeah, so the anti-speciesist argument has a negative and a positive part. There's this argument that says that species is not really morally relevant itself, and then the open question is, well, what is morally relevant if it's not species? And often the suggestions is certain differences in, I'll call it broadly, mental life. But that's up for grabs, and there's different things about duties and utilitarianism, blah, blah, blah. But I was just going to say about Singer has this famous book he wrote in '75 called Animal Liberation.
Oh, yes,
He's written several books since then, but that's a really important book on sort of the animal rights obligation scene.
And I think I actually have, I'm going to write it down again, but on I'm constructing your reading list for this project, so I appreciate that reference, and we'll definitely look at it. Thank you.
I just wanted to add a footnote to what you were saying about philosophy and film. I think film is a philosophical situation for the viewer. I think it's a situation of which is like the existential moment, a situation of experiencing the feeling of becoming. As we sit in the film and watch it become something that we have no real sense of where it's going. And I think that is like an inherently philosophical situation, even though most of us don't realize that when we're experiencing it.
Sort of being with the film in that moment.
In a sense, Sartrean existentialism, where the feeling is that one's life isn't decided until it is in the process of becoming, until it's over. And I just think that film often presents us with philosophical points across the spectrum without us realizing.
There are definitely lots of interesting sort of modes of being that are presented in them, and I think that the new tendency, I mean, it's recent, it happened in neorealism with films like La Terra Trema, which represented Sicily in Sicilian dialect. It was subtitled and voice-overed for Italian audiences who couldn't necessarily understand. With the advent of television in the 50s, people were convinced that dialect was going to disappear, and films like this really attest to a vital insistence on keeping dialect alive. It's staying alive in these rural communities and in larger communities and through cinema. And so there's some way in which an experience of a film like this one for Italian audiences is a sort of being with a linguistic and cultural community. It's a very acoustic experience that I think really does transport people into places they've never imagined being and gives them a sense of belonging to a community whose borders are then both defined and dissolved at the same time. So I think films like, especially like Il Vento fa il suo giro, and that are working around all of the government's funding at times and finding funding and borrowings and sort of interesting ways to construct the films themselves are one of the most exciting things happening in Italian film.
I was going to say, it's also true there's a lot of discussion in contemporary American philosophy about film and the relationship between philosophy and film, and also lots of people, including myself, sometimes teach a course called Introduction to Philosophy through film, but we'll use things like The Matrix to introduce skeptical problems, or Crimes and Misdemeanors to raise the why be moral question. Or so often I use films to raise questions that then I discuss philosophically. But there are other people who think actually that film can both illustrate and make philosophical points in a way that analytic philosophers argue. They even think that fiction films of certain sorts present a kind of argument. And there's a lot of, as far as I can see, there's hardly any interdiscussion between continental philosophy and American philosophy. So it seems like they're proceeding in maybe different tracks, but they both have interest in the same subject matter.
And you see that tendency in American philosophy or in continental?
I think American philosophers don't pay much attention to continental philosophy. I think there's a lot of continental philosophers in Germany and some in Italy who are quite interested in analytic philosophy, not so many in France, but for the most part, in American institutions, analytic philosophy dominates, and there are very few PhD granting institutions that pay much attention to continental philosophy.
And this is, I mean, definitely a potential point of encounter between those areas, and I'd be interested also to see your syllabus for a course that sounds really interesting.
I guess I just had a comment about the concept of hospitality and how it functions, and how it also seems to function in blurring these boundaries and creating this in-between space. Because I thought it was interesting, the shot you had where the dog is welcoming this guy to the community, or human beings welcoming the goats, and it seems like hospitality is a concept that is one concept that allows for this going in between. I don't know if you could comment on that more.
Well, I think the area of hospitality, and in fact, I have a friend who works on contemporary Italy and this issue of hospitality to immigrants through Derrida's ideas of conditional and unconditional hospitality, and sees that in contemporary Italy, a lot of the hospitality apparently extended is extremely conditional, and so it only takes a crisis precipitated to sort of define, show the limits of